Ultor, a brighter future and a better life.
As many of you know, the retrospective on Saints Row was a tremendous success, but that was just the beginning of what Hexagon has in mind for Stillwater. This is Saints Row. Once a pristine set of badass gangs, this franchise has devolved into a pathetic joke show, filled with undesirables such as these. Now I'm sure a lot of you are wondering, ugly people, unwashed politics, what the hell is Hexagon thinking? My friends, we're thinking about the future. Picture this, sloppy seconds, frosted tips, and everyone below the poverty line trying to wash your car. Impossible? For a lesser company, maybe. Now I'm not here to make idle promises or vague predictions. No offense to all you Discorders out there. No, I'm here to show you how we're going to do it. Now obviously, before we can remodel Saints Row, we need to own the brand. So how do we do that? By directing the fans towards Saints Row 2, not only are we lowering the number of reboot buyers, we're lowering the property value as well, which means when we buy the brand, the savings get passed on to you, the stockholders. The fans cripple each other, we direct funds towards conservative groups, they increase political presence, and pretty soon all those nasty little social justice warriors are gone. Crime starts, property value goes down, and now your population looks like this. Every successful game franchise has that one game that is almost universally recognized by fans as the best in the series. For example, with Halo, it's Halo 3. For World of Warcraft, it's Wrath of the Lich King. And for Sonic, it's Dr. Robotnik's Mean Bean Machine. Doesn't matter what franchise you pick, if it has more than 3 entries, there will be a fan favorite. And for Saints Row, it's Saints Row 2. And look, here's the thing. In order for a game to become the fan favorite, it has to be good, which in the case of all those games I listed earlier, is true. However, the internet, especially these days, tends to trend towards being very single-minded when it comes to opinions. You say one thing that goes against the hive mind on practically any topic, and all of a sudden, you've got a bunch of giga nerds on your ass giving you a 5-Bible-long essay on why you're wrong. But the fact is that all those games I listed earlier also had flaws, and Saints Row 2 is no different. You know, I could very easily sit here and just kiss the arse of Saints Row 2 and pretend it's the second coming for the next 30 minutes, as people may expect of me. But if you're a long-time viewer of mine, you'll know that's not how I roll. The fact of the matter is that Saints Row 2 is indeed a fantastic game that in many ways is a direct upgrade from its predecessor. But it is not, as so many like to claim, a perfect game. It has its flaws, and we shall be discussing them alongside what it did well, whether people like it or not. So without further ado, let's begin. So back in 2006, after playing Saints Row 1, it goes without saying that I was beyond impressed and wanted more. So when Saints Row 2 was announced, you can bet that it was a day one buy. However, this would actually be something that I would later go on to regret. Not because of the game itself, mind you, but because of something you may not expect. Some of you long-time viewers may have noticed that I own not just one copy of Saints Row 2, but 2. One for the 360 and the other for the PC. Now naturally, some of you may assume that the reason I have 2 copies is so that I could play it on 2 different platforms, and this would be a completely logical assumption to make. But you'd also be wrong. The only reason I own 2 copies of Saints Row 2 is because my first copy, the 360 version, actually broke through no fault of my own. Not many people seem to know this, but when Saints Row 2 first came out, it had some serious manufacturing issues in regards to some of its discs. For example, if you take a look at my Saints Row 1 disc here, you'll notice that it looks completely normal, just as it should. However, if you take a look at my Saints Row 2 disc, you'll notice this very strange circular scratch around its base. Now, needless to say, this scratch is far too circular and precise to be of human intervention. So where did it come from? Well, I'm told that this is what happens when your Xbox 360 has a faulty disc reader. Rather than read from the disc as intended, it instead destroys the disc by creating these scratches until it is eventually rendered borderline unreadable. However, this disc does actually still play Saints Row 2, but just constantly bugs out and crashes. My 360 didn't scratch any other disc that it ever tried to read, except this one, which makes me think that this is more of a case of some sort of poor quality disc rather than a faulty disc reader as originally thought. But whatever the case, I'd be interested to hear if anyone else had this issue back then, as it's been bothering me for years now. Now, the PC version, which despite its physical appearance is actually just a Steam key, was of course much more stable due to it not having to rely on a disc. Granted, hearing the words Saints Row 2 PC and stable in the same sentence these days is likely to give you a chuckle, as there are few PC games with a worse reputation for having a terrible port than Saints Row 2, and according to Steam reviews, it is notoriously prone to crashes. It worked well when I last played it, but that was back when I was on Windows Vista, so shouldn't really be too much of a surprise that today your experience may vary. Regardless, it is at least great to see the Saints Row franchise actually available on other platforms, as opposed to just the Xbox this time around. Now, Saints Row 2 is actually a direct sequel to Saints Row 1. As such, I will always recommend that people go back and play Saints Row 1 first if they haven't already, regardless of how inaccessible it may be. As though you can certainly get away with enjoying Saints Row 2 as a standalone product, there are a lot of references to the first game that really put this one into context. Heck, Saints Row 2 doesn't just reference past games either, it also references future games too. I mean, take a look at this. Crazy stuff. No, but seriously, this game begins right where the last one left off, which becomes immediately apparent by how the game starts. At the end of Saints Row 1, you, the player, are blown up in a, shall we say, boat accident, giving you the impression that you are, well, dead. However, at the start of Saints Row 2, it is confirmed that in fact, you miraculously survived, and was merely in a coma for a few years. But don't celebrate too soon, as you're also in prison. Yeah, Volition taking a page out of Bethesda's book for this one.
Stop right there, criminal scum!
After coming to this sobering realization, just like in Saints Row 1, you get to make your character. And I'm quite pleased to report that pretty much all of the problems I had with the character creator in Saints Row 1 have been addressed here. For example, whereas in Saints Row 1 there was basically no good long hair options for hippies like me, in Saints Row 2 there's plenty. Granted, this is likely an unintended side effect of the other gripe I had that has also now been addressed, that being that you can now also play as a lady. Yeah, that's right, congratulations ladies and Redditors, the option is now available for you. Back on topic, however, I went into this thinking that I would now, given the additional long hair options, make myself. So, I did. And I mean, hey, it looks better than the Bob Ross reject from Saints Row 1, but just as I was about to start the game, I felt an overwhelming level of sadness come over me. What about Blobby? I mean, he had been there for me all the way throughout Saints Row 1, and to simply retcon him from existence? No, I couldn't. And so, ladies and gentlemen, once again, I am proud to introduce Blobby. Yes, he's back, and bigger than ever. Now, what makes a good sequel is when they take what they did in the first game and do it again, but better. And in many ways, Saints Row 2 does just that. Not only has the character creator been improved to allow for even more precise customization, but they've even added unique additions that you may not have necessarily expected. And for example, you can now pick how your character walks, from a typical gangster thug walk to, well, whatever this is. Yeah, to be honest, that's exactly how I expected Blobby to walk. We're rolling with it. You can also choose your own personal positive emote, as well as a negative one too, both of which you can use while out in the world to screw around with.
Have you survived a boat explosion? Didn't think so.
You can even pick your own preferred facial expression, and this one specifically looks like the soy face that every clickbait YouTuber puts in their thumbnail these days, doesn't it? You know what I'm talking about. Check out this amazing news you just can't live without! Perhaps most interesting of all, however, is that you can now even select your own voice.
I'm tougher than I look.
And being able to select your voice is a truly surprising option for many different reasons. In Saints Row 1, your character barely talks at all, except on a mere handful of occasions at most, leaving many to wonder if he was some sort of mute.
Hope you don't mind hepatitis. What?
But in Saints Row 2, he talks all the time. Now, if you've only played Saints Row 2, you wouldn't really be aware of this at all, but if you've gone from Saints Row 1 and then to 2, it's something that becomes immediately apparent. The player, or now as he will be known, the boss, has had a complete change of persona. Now granted, being in a coma for such a long time does kind of damage your brain a little, so it shouldn't really be too much of a surprise really, but still. It is still weird to see how such a change is never really directly noted by pretty much anyone. Everyone just kinda goes along with the fact that this guy who once never spoke now jabbers his mouth all the time without so much of a comment on it. It's weird, but whatever. Volition thought it would be cool to have a voice protagonist this time around, and I've gotta say, that must have been a lot of work recording all the boss's lines 6 times over. The fact I can now play as a British fellow is much appreciated.
Don't worry, I'm not gonna kill ya.
Granted, having a silent protagonist does allow players to project themselves into the character as opposed to having their personal narrative dictated to, but whatever. This is a crime sim, not an RPG. Now after making your character, you get introduced to a fellow known as Carlos, who tells you some bad news. Though the Saints once ruled Stillwater, in the time you've been in a coma, they have since been disbanded, and other gangs have now taken their place. Essentially, putting you in almost the exact same situation as you were right at the start of Saints Row 1, the underdog against 3 titans. In fact, it is arguably even more of a dire situation than then, as at the start of this game, there isn't even any Saints to join. So, you both break out of jail, which kind of serves as a short tutorial, and end up back on the streets to rebuild the Saints from scratch and take back what's rightfully yours from these newcomers. But just who are these newcomers? Well, I'm glad you asked. Starting with my favourite of the 3, represented by the colour of red, is the Brotherhood. Known for their obsession with tattoos, trucks and raw muscle, the Brotherhood are very much a gang that tolerates no nonsense, and will gladly punish you in the most brutal ways possible if you try to give them any. Led by their hot-headed leader Mero, the Brotherhood specialise in the arms trade, making them quite the resistant target. As a result, they have claimed all of the territories that were once owned by Los Canales with absolute success. Paired with Carlos, it's up to you to put an end to this Brotherhood once and for all. Next, represented by the colour of yellow, is the Ronin. Hailing from Japan, this bike-obsessed gang, and yes, you can ride bikes now, have come to the United States with the aim of spreading their influence abroad. However, whereas in Japan the Ronin are led by a wise man known as Kazuo Akuji, their American branch is instead led by his foolish son, Shogo Akuji, making them immensely vulnerable against external threats. Despite this, their dealings in gambling and prostitution have proven to be highly lucrative, leading them to take the place of the Vice Kings in downtown. Paired with Gat and your new Lieutenant Piers, it's up to you to say sayonara to this gang of menaces. And lastly, represented by the colour of green, is the Sons of Somdi. This drug manufacturing superpower is renowned for creating their highly addicting and highly available lower dust formula, which has caused huge sections of the city's most vulnerable into becoming mindless addicts. Led by their esteemed general and his right-hand man, Mr. Sunshine, the Sons of Somdi have placed themselves as Stillwater's prime monopoly in the drug trade, swiping up large sections of what was once Westside Rollers territory with relative ease. Paired with your new Lieutenant Shaundy, it's up to you to put them out of business and take their place. So they're the 3 gangs, and just like in Saints Row 1, you can deal with them in any order you want, and slowly take back your territory from them piece by piece by doing missions. However, I do have some gripes with the missions in this game, one of which being an imbalance of quality. For example, the reason the Brotherhood are my favourite gang in the game is not actually because I particularly like them or their style, but because I find their storyline to be way more interesting than the others. Their narrative, cutscenes and missions in general just felt like they had a lot more effort put into them compared to the others. The Ronin were pretty cool too and were certainly the most unique gang out of the three, but the Sons of Somdi, man, every single mission of theirs just has you killing people over and over again. I mean, there's one mission that lasts for what feels like forever, where that's all you even do. I feel like though this gang had the potential to be cool, it was ultimately let down by its immensely boring missions. But preference is up to perspective, and for some they may prefer that kind of style. What isn't up for debate, however, is that Saints Row 2 has vastly improved cinematography via its cutscenes when compared to the first game. There are a lot more well-choreographed moments that certainly make it a memorable experience, to say the least. One of my biggest complaints about Saints Row 1's missions was that I found them to be all quite easy. Thankfully, this has been somewhat remedied in Saints Row 2 with the addition of multiple difficulty options. There are 3 to choose from, and if you know me, you already know what I'm going to say. I of course, as ever, picked the hardest, which in this case is called Hardcore. So now, you're probably expecting me to say that as a result of such difficulty options, the game is now much harder, more rewarding, and thus much better. However, I'm afraid not. You see, Saints Row 2 on Hardcore is certainly more difficult than its predecessor, but not in a good way. In games, a good hard mode is rewarding because it presents you with a challenge that initially seems impossible, but with more practice and the honing of your skills, slowly becomes a piece of cake. However, a bad hard mode just pulls stunts like killing you off randomly without giving you a proper chance to respond, essentially putting victory down to RNG as opposed to skill. Saints Row 2, I am afraid to say, is the latter. The sheer amount of times I died in this game to some off-screen rocket launcher that I was never informed about is unbelievable. In fact, when I started to notice this trend, I figured that many may think I'm just being unnecessarily critical or perhaps a bit salty, so I made sure to get a compilation so you can see what I mean. Getting blown up by a rocket launcher off-screen is not difficult, it's incessant. When games pull stunts like this, it's like the horror movie equivalent of a jump scare. It's cheap. Granted, hardcore difficulty does have some actually challenging additions, such as much slower health regeneration, which when taken on its own merit, makes this an improved challenge over the original. The respect system that requires you to have respect in order to actually do missions has yet again made a return from the first game, and has actually been expanded on even further. Not that you'll particularly care, as getting respect in this game is unbelievably easy, with you getting a ton passively just by playing the game. Clothing in this game has also been significantly improved. I mean, the amount of customization that you can now do is genuinely unbelievable. In fact, I don't think I've ever played a game with better clothing customization in my life. Oh, and of course, don't worry, there's also a lot of very, very silly looking clothes, so if you're like me and like to dress up like a complete fool, you still can. Hooray! But rather than certain clothes amplifying respect in quite a hard to calculate and arbitrary fashion as they did in the first game, you now have what's called style levels that amplifies respect by an absolute set percentage depending on how flashy the clothes you buy are. But style level isn't just determined by your clothes, but also your cribs. Unlike in the first game whereby you were rewarded a crib after you defeated a rival gang, now you can simply go around the city and purchase them outright so long as you have the money. And after doing so, you can even customize them for even more cash, transforming them from an ugly shack into a proper jolly pad, which will increase your style level as such. Which is, you know, cool. But the customization really isn't anything groundbreaking by any means. You can't individually move furniture around or anything like that. So don't get the impression that this is like The Sims build mode or Halo's Forge. If anything, it's just a few minuscule and mostly barely noticeable options. It's cool, yes, but ultimately quite hollow. And I'm going to be honest with you, I actually preferred Saints Row 1's cribs. Though they weren't customizable at all, I liked the feeling of laying about in what was once your rival's headquarters. The cribs in Saints Row 1 actually represent something, and that something was your victory. Whereas the cribs in Saints Row 2 really are just random buildings that you have zero relation to whatsoever. I wish that, rather than the cribs just being random purchased buildings, that every time you defeated a rival gang, you got their headquarters as a crib, just like in the first game. However, then you would be able to customize it to make it even more saintly. That would be cool. Though there are more cribs overall in Saints Row 2, quality over quantity is an almost universal rule, and in this case, I'd willingly have accepted just 3 or 4 cribs if it meant they had more effort and customizability options available individually. But hey, at least there's an autosave now, so praise the Lord. The activities system from the first game has too made a return. However, it too has been changed up significantly. Some activities got scrapped. Hijacking, thank God. Some got changed, and there are even some new ones. So, just like last time, I thought I'd go through them all from my most favourite to my least.
This is the Stillwater Police Department, and their job is simple: to serve and protect, and to protect and serve. Tonight, you'll join Officer Blobby in roaming the streets, dealing with all the cretins that drive down our communities once and for all. Welcome to Fuzz.
You guys remember that old American TV show called Cops, where they basically followed around a police officer on patrol and kind of documented what it was like in the force? It was an absolute classic. It even made its way over here in the UK. Well, this activity is based on that, except you're imitating an officer and purposely going out of your way to make them look bad while being filmed. I think that this activity doesn't really require an extended definition to explain why it's fun. You never know what's coming next. It's challenging but not too frustrating. It doesn't overstay its welcome. It has an interesting concept. I mean, yeah, it's just great. Every activity in the game should be as thrilling as this one. My second favourite is Demolition Derby. Whereas in the first game I found this activity to be an immense chore, I actually really enjoyed it here. It's been much improved, allowing you to select what kind of vehicle you want to use, as well as giving you the options to upgrade it using points you get from winning. Got to say, I feel a little bit dumb here, as originally I had no idea that you could actually use nitrous, so I just kept losing over and over again until I figured it out, and then it was a piece of cake. But yeah, don't make the same mistake I did. Was a lot of fun, and even when you're done, there's still a lot of bonus stages you can do whereby, though you don't gain respect, you do get money, so it's somewhat useful early on in the game. Volition could have very easily just re-released this activity just as it was in the first game, but the fact they went back and made so many improvements, I find very admirable. Serious question for my American viewers: is Demolition Derby a real thing? Seriously, I've never heard of it. Is it real? Like, there's actually stadiums full of dusty old cars where people bash them into each other and see which one's the last man standing? Is this really a thing, or is this made up? Because I've heard of Demolition Derby before, but I just can't believe it's real. Let me know, please. Next up is another newcomer, and that's Septic Avenger. Alright, now this one is just crazy. So, you go around in a septic truck that's full of crap, and spray it on buildings and vehicles in order to cause as much property damage as possible to your enemies. Now I like this one because you don't actually have to drive around the truck yourself, you just merely choose when to tell the driver to stop and start, allowing you to take your time painting the world in such a majestic manner. Like some sort of opposite day version of Super Mario Sunshine. My only complaint with Septic Avenger is that I was once asked to spray such filth on the local church, which of course, being a man of the Lord, I absolutely refused to do. Shooting NPCs, oh, I'm okay with that. Robbing cars, I'm okay with that too. But defacing a virtual building of the Lord? You have gone too far. Fortunately, it was optional, so I still managed to pass. No, but seriously, this was top notch. On to the more middle-of-the-road activities now, starting with drug trafficking. Indeed, what was my favourite activity in the first game has since been demoted to a mere 4th place. Drug trafficking is not bad in this game by any means, but I would say it's somewhat worse. You're still driving around with a dealer protecting them as they sell their drugs, however now, buyers can sometimes betray you and try to run away without paying, leading you to have to go and chase after them. And it's not terrible by any means, but I definitely preferred the exclusive riding shotgun action rather than anticipating a dice roll whether or not I'm going to have to get out the car and chase someone down after every deal. Ultimately, however, it has simply been dethroned by far more fun activities, and in a way, that's a good thing. Next up, we're going to break Rule 1 and talk about Fight Club. Here, you get plunged into an arena with a bunch of others and you have to be the last man standing. Or as we in the UK call it, a typical night in Manchester. You can finish off your opponents using finishing move combos and sometimes even use objects that get thrown into the arena to assist you. If you've ever played a wrestling game before, you kinda get the gist. When you're low on health, you can also use food that gets thrown in as well, and though I'll be honest, I'm not sure I'd want to eat a donut that's been thrown into a boxing ring, but whatever. The difficulty of Fight Club almost completely depends on the amount of opponents you have, and with each level you progress, there will be more opponents, until it gets to the point whereby it just becomes overwhelming, which is part of the challenge. For such a simple activity, I was quite surprised with how much fun I actually had with it. Big props. Next up is Mayhem. Mayhem has made a return from the first game, whereby you cause as much, well, mayhem as possible before time runs out. However, I will say that I found this iteration of Mayhem to be significantly less fun than its predecessor, mostly due to what I spoke about earlier. During Mayhem, you obviously get quite a high police notoriety. Helicopters turn up with rockets that can destroy you in one shot. And they're really bloody quiet too, so again, the amount of times I just randomly died while trying to do this made it an immensely frustrating experience overall, at least in the later stages. Another familiar face is insurance fraud, and keeping with the trend, this activity has too been somewhat changed since the first game. In some ways for the better, in some ways for the worse. So you'll remember that in insurance fraud you have to cause as much damage to yourself as possible before time runs out. And in the first game, sometimes you would die to crash damage if you didn't ragdoll yourself early enough. Fortunately in this iteration you are much more resistant to such accidental damage, which is good. What's not so good, however, is the addition of this new adrenaline bar. Basically, the more damage you do to yourself, the more the adrenaline bar fills, until it reaches the max, whereby you enter a sort of super ragdoll mode, whereby you go flying even further and get even more cash. Problem is, however, that not only is this a proper pain in the ass to control, but you can only get an efficient amount of adrenaline in so-called bonus areas, which are often an equally painful place to get to under such time constraints. Though the adrenaline system was clearly meant to improve insurance fraud, in reality, I think all it did was unnecessarily overcomplicate it. Sometimes, simple is just better. Escort up next, and yeah, really not much to say here. It's remained basically unchanged from the last game, whereby you drive two wrestlers around in the back of a car, except now it sometimes asks you to do some weird car stunts, which are a bit annoying. If you liked it last time, you'll like it here too. If you didn't, you won't here either. In Tandem Snatch, whereby you save ladies from their pimps, is also borderline identical, except this time around they made it a bit more annoying, as the pimps can actually now steal back the ladies you've rescued, which... oh, who asked for this? I mean look, I'm fine with more complex activities, but this is just annoying. A really interesting newcomer is crowd control. Now apart from the name bringing me back to my World of Warcraft days, I like crowd control because it's just so unique. You know how in real life there's celebrity red carpet events where a bunch of low IQ zombie idiots follow them around and try and take photos of them? Yeah, it's pretty much like that. You become a bodyguard for a celebrity, and you must protect them from some of their most obsessive fans by dealing with them accordingly. And when I say dealing with them accordingly, I mean dealing with them accordingly. It can get overwhelming, especially near the end levels, but all in all, I really commend Volition for this one, as it's just so refreshing to have an activity that doesn't just involve shooting or driving for once. But speaking of an activity that involves shooting and driving, let's talk about Heli Assault. That's right, you can now fly in still water. So of course, there just has to be a flying-based activity. And this is it. Here you have to fly around protecting your dudes from hostile threats by blowing the daylights out of them from above. Your enjoyment of this activity will all depend on whether or not you like manoeuvring a helicopter or not. If you do, you will love it. If you don't, you will hate it. Personally, I'm quite mixed. I mean, it's not bad, but it's not good either. And speaking of not great, it's time to get to my least favourite activities, starting with Trailblazing. This is another new activity whereby you drive around on some sort of quad bike that causes everything it touches, including people, to spontaneously combust. Now, it's a race against the clock, whereby the clock is actively against you, causing you to have to balance out between causing destruction to get more time and actually getting to where you need to go. And look, it's alright, but my word, driving this thing is a complete pain in the arse. In fact, I don't think I've ever seen anything that even compares to such a delicately precise vehicle in my life. Driving this is like trying to play Jenga when you've got Parkinson's. I mean, it's just completely unnecessarily frustrating. If racing and mayhem merged, this would pretty much be the result, for better or worse. Speaking of racing, yep, it's back, and man do I wish it wasn't. I never liked racing that much in the first game, but here they somehow managed to make it even worse. In this new updated racing, you no longer actually race against anyone. No, instead you're just racing against the clock, just like in Trailblazing, but without the, blazing. And I have no bloody idea what they were thinking with this. I mean, look, you guys know I'm not a racing games kind of guy. I mean, hell, the last racing game I liked was Project Gotham Racing 3 back in 2006, okay? But I do know one thing about racing games, and that's that the joy you get from them is from, racing. Going from racing against AI to racing against the clock just feels like a complete and utter downgrade straight up. Please no Hitman and Chop Shop. Please no Hitman and Chop Shop. Please no Hitman and Chop Shop. Please no... Oh, yeah, Hitman is back with another list of targets for you to find. However, though this was the bane of my existence back in Saints Row 1, I am exceptionally pleased to report that it has been much improved here. I mean, to be fair, it would be quite a challenge to make it worse. For one, the NPCs are actually in the places they say they are this time around, and many of them are spawnable via action. So unlike last time, you're not required to mope around for hours trying to find that one guy via RNG. In fact, many of the targets you will simply find just by playing the game passively, as they appear on your minimap regardless of focus. In addition, no longer are you required to use a specific weapon to cap them, so you should never be in a situation whereby you find a target but can't get the credit. Basically, every problem that Hitman had has since been resolved. Doesn't change the fact it's not fun at all, but still. And Chop Shop, the vehicle version of Hitman, has also been vastly improved in a similar fashion, with the vehicle's locations being accurately labelled and no longer requiring bogus mods in order to be handed in. Again, I still can't stand it, but still, better is better, and we have to give credit where it's due. So yeah, there's the activities. Some really good additions, some really bad additions, some really good changes, and some really bad changes. Overall, it's a mixed bag, but I have to say, there's certainly a lot more choice at your disposal than the original game, which can only be a good thing. A shame the rewards for doing these activities are pretty lame in comparison. Exciting. Now, let's talk about tone. Saints Row 2 has somewhat less of a realistic tone than its predecessor. Not by a wide margin, mind you, but there are some things that are quite daft. For example, having a samurai sword fight in a dojo, or receiving damage from being pricked by a voodoo doll. None of these things in particular ruin the overall experience, as such moments are rare, and sometimes from a gameplay perspective actually quite cool. But it is clear that Volition wanted to move the series in a less serious direction with this game, which in many ways only foreshadows what was to come in the future. Whereas Saints Row 1 had a somewhat grounded and some would say flat narrative, Saints Row 2 does sometimes feel a bit like a cheesy action movie, with the boss acting, to be blunt, like a complete bastard throughout most of the game. Which brings us on to a really important point, and that's that the modus operandi of the Saints has radically transformed in comparison to the first game. And to prove this point, we have to talk about Ultor. You see, though Saints Row 2 does indeed have 3 different gangs, lurking in the shadows lies another group that can only be dealt with after knocking out the others. And that group is Ultor. Ultor is not a gang, it is a company, or more accurately, a corporation. What was once just a mere clothing company has since blossomed into a multifaceted business empire that has its hands in almost everything. Upon breaking out of prison and returning back to Stillwater, one of the first things you will notice is that the city looks almost completely different than it did in the first game. And one of the main reasons for this is because the Ultor Corporation has invested $383,781,187 into renovating the city. And no place has changed more than Saints Row. Whereas in the first game, Saints Row was a downtrodden, deprived area filled with low-quality housing, in this game, Ultor has completely transformed the place into a clean, beautiful metropolis that even serves as a tourist attraction. And almost every part of the city has been improved in some way by them, perhaps not as much as Saints Row, but improved nonetheless. For example, the city has received a massive extension with a fitted university district, so that the youth of Stillwater can get degrees in important topics such as sociology or progressive dance theory. After all, educating the youth is the top priority for maintaining a healthy nation. Downtown also feels a lot more flashy than it did before, and this logic holds true in general, with the city having more neon lights than the 1980s. Sadly, the place that arguably needed the most development, the Factories District, still remains quite poor and deprived, and this ultimately is the largest critique one can give Ultor. They are very good at what they do, which is, as their motto implies, creating a brighter future and a better life, but not for everyone. Ultor may have renovated Saints Row into a beautiful metropolis of glass, but in reality, all they've done is created another downtown, and in the process, displaced the poor who previously resided there, likely via some sort of eminent domain. In the UK, we have a similar problem, whereby London has been flooded with overseas investors and corporate interests, skyrocketing the price of the average property in the process. And when I say skyrocketed, I mean skyrocketed. Take a look at this beauty. Oh yeah. Absolutely. Kind of looks like, it looks like, have you ever played Grand Theft Auto? And you've got like a 5-star wanted rating and you want to like lose the rating, so you go into one of those garages and it sprays your car a different colour and then you're no longer wanted. It kind of looks like one of them, doesn't it? I don't know, I'm sure it's not just me, but yeah. Anyway, that's the house. Obviously, the rest of it you're not getting, it's just this part. Folks, I am not joking with you. 1.5 million. As a result, rather than wealth being spread out evenly across the country, it instead consolidates in London and its surrounding areas, leaving the rest of the country to rot. Ultor is in many ways a similar representation of such an attitude, forsaking the poor so long as they themselves can profiteer from such consolidation. Regardless, however, though Ultor is indeed the stereotypical representation of an elitist corporation, ultimately, and bear with me here, I do actually think that they are a force for good. Now, I know, but allow me to play devil's advocate for a moment. Let's go back to Saints Row 1 for a moment and remember why it was that the Saints were created in the first place. Originally, Stillwater had no gangs, but then came Los Canales, who started to terrorize the city. So Ben King alongside Julius created the Vice Kings to get them gone, and after a while, the rollers soon turned up as well. Julius left the Vice Kings because he believed rather than fight the gangs and clean up the streets as intended, the Vice Kings instead just turned into what it was they were fighting. So he created the 3rd Street Saints in order to clean up the streets once and for all. After successfully wiping out the other gangs, the Saints were all that remained, and thus, having done their job, they disbanded. Now obviously this wasn't the smartest move, as soon as the Saints disbanded, other gangs just ended up taking their place. But nevertheless, it doesn't surprise me in the slightest that many of the Saints from Saints Row 1 decided to join Ultor upon their arrival to Stillwater, as Ultor, in a way, aligns quite well with the goals of the original 3rd Street Saints. After all, both want to clean up the streets, but just do it in different ways, and of course, for different reasons. In the first game, the Third Street Saints were violent and ultimately criminal, yes, but they had a noble cause, and did what they did in the hopes of a peaceful future for themselves. Whereas Ultor, in a way, unintentionally represents that noble cause, but for selfish reasons. So logically speaking, why wouldn't the Saints join Ultor after the Saints have been disbanded? They almost perfectly align. The point here is that the Saints in Saints Row 1 had a clear purpose, and that purpose was to clean up the streets. But in Saints Row 2, the Saints seem less concerned about cleaning up the streets, and more just ensuring that they are the ones who make them dirty. And that's a big change in modus operandi.
Listen up, people. I got some serious shit to discuss.
Alright, everybody listen up. We got some serious shit to discuss.
Troy, you dealing with the Vice Kings.
Not a chance.
Fuck you say?
Shandy, you got the Sons of Sandy.
It's gotta be them.
Fuck you say?
Once we're done here, go talk to one of these guys. They'll have something for you to do.
Once we're done here, talk to one of these guys. They'll have something for you to do.
It's our time now. Let's get this shit started.
It's our time now. Let's get this shit started.
Though to be honest, in a way, this is a pretty good representation of how success can change people for the worse. Almost every single successful person inevitably goes through what's called the celebrity life cycle, which consists of 3 phases. Phase 1 is the rise, whereby due to having a unique and noble purpose, the person in question reaches huge levels of success over an extended period of time. After a while they enter Phase 2, the peak, whereby due to said success, the person starts to change by taking their life for granted and becoming very egotistical. And finally in Phase 3, the fall, they completely forget their roots and who it is they were, and in an ironic twist of fate, tend to become that of which they originally thought against. In this scale, narratively speaking, Saints Row 1 can be seen as the rise, whereas Saints Row 2 can be seen as the peak. And as for the fall, well, we all know what comes after. In many ways, Stillwater in Saints Row 2 is certainly an upgrade over Stillwater in Saints Row 1. It's flashy, with tons of eye-catching sights, it's larger, featuring a great nature zone, and it features a ton more interiors, like this cool museum. Oh look, there's even a staircase to the future. Let's take a look.
Hey guys!
Alright, never mind. And as mentioned earlier, the city has even been upgraded to allow flight. Oh, and you can also drive boats too, with numerous different little islands to explore. Despite being the same city as the last game, it certainly feels very different, and I think that it isn't justified to accuse Volition of being lazy here. They've put a lot of effort into this new Stillwater, and that has to be commended. But ultimately, I just can't help but think that this more modern and evolved Stillwater has somewhat lost a bit of its charm from the original game, and originally, I just couldn't figure out why. I mean, there are a lot of small things about this more modern Stillwater that are individually irrelevant, but ultimately combined degrade its overall character. Like for example, in Saints Row 1 if you wanted to go back and replay a mission, you had to go to a cinema, which were pretty cool places. But in Saints Row 2 you just do it from your crib, which feels like a loss of character that's completely unnecessary. Some stores have been merged, such as the barbers and plastic surgeons, and all of the stores which used to close at night so you could break in and rob them are now open 24/7, which, I understand the change as it was annoying as hell to have to wait for them to open. Weirdly enough, despite all these changes of convenience, they did for some reason decide to make melee weapons stores their own thing this time around, despite labelling them with a gun icon on the map. Yeah, don't ask me. But regardless, overall, I tend not to like changes that sacrifice flavour for convenience, and originally I thought that this was the reason why I didn't really like the city as much as the first game. But ultimately, I realised the real reason, and that reason is the graphics. A lot of people are going to get angry at me here, but the truth must be told, and the truth is that Saints Row 2, from a graphical perspective, looks awful. Now obviously a game from 2008 is going to look awful by today's standards, but that's not what I mean. After all, I never said the same thing about Saints Row 1, and that's the ultimate point. Saints Row 2 is, without any shadow of a doubt, a direct graphical downgrade compared to its predecessor. Now it's weird because if you were to just jump headfirst into Saints Row 2, you wouldn't notice any problems, but if you go from playing the first game and then the second, you'll immediately know what I'm talking about. Saints Row 2, for some reason, looks incredibly washed out and, to be blunt, terrible in comparison. I mean, if you go to the exact same place in both games and put them side by side, you'll know exactly what I mean. And no, it isn't just the weather. Saints Row 1, in comparison, looks so much more vibrant. But sequels are meant to look better, not worse, so what gives? Originally, I thought that perhaps some graphical sacrifices had to be made for the sake of gameplay improvements, such as cutting back on texture quality in order to make flight possible or something like that. And this logic would have checked out, as there are numerous examples of the game failing to load in assets quick enough. Like when you run into this museum and it takes a while for the game to catch up. Or the horrendous performance when dealing with water physics of any kind, giving the impression that it's struggling to run given the scope of its ambition on the limited hardware of the time. But ultimately, I think the main issue that makes this game look worse than the last is the lighting system. Some drastic changes to the way the game engine's lighting operates has clearly occurred, and it just doesn't look good. These clips here somewhat speak for themselves. The lighting in the game seems to operate almost like a screen filter that drastically changes depending on where you are, and most of the time, these filters just make the game look worse than if they weren't enabled to begin with. Right at the end of the first Brotherhood mission, you actually get a brief glimpse of what the outside would look like without such filters, and it looks absolutely gorgeous. So why Volition felt the need to implement them in the first place, I don't know. Perhaps their goal was to make Saints Row 2 look better by making it less vibrant and more realistic? But if that was their goal, then they ultimately failed, as the game looks worse by almost every metric, and for a sequel, that's quite an achievement. And this is by far my biggest gripe with Saints Row 2 as a whole. From a gameplay perspective, you'd be hard pressed to find anything that Saints Row 2 doesn't do better than the original. But from a purely cosmetics perspective, it is a major letdown. Something I do like about Saints Row 2 is that there's a lot of small things littered around the world for you to do. For example, in the casino you can play games such as blackjack and poker. Not that I have any clue how to play them, that is. And in your crib, you can play this mini-game on the TV called Zombie Uprising, which is kind of like a third-person version of the Call of Duty Zombies mode. That's pretty crap, if I'm being honest with you, but still, I like it when games add features that are completely unnecessary and unexpected, as extra effort should always be applauded. Speaking of extra effort, we need to talk about this game's radio. Back when Volition was making Saints Row 1, there was a lot of risk involved. It was a new IP, and they had no idea if it would be a hit or not. Therefore, they couldn't just splash the cash on mainstream tracks, and instead decided to settle on relatively unknown and underground artists instead. But with Saints Row 2, the proof of interest was there, and thus it's clear that Volition felt much more confident to put in the extra cash required to license some more mainstream tracks. And license they did. Ladies and gentlemen, it's once again time for the tier list. Alright, so starting with S tier, come on, you know what it's gonna be. The Mix. The Mix is a new station that features tracks from the 1980s containing such classic hits as Take On Me and Everyone Wants to Rule the World. And as a 1980s musical hipster, I just have to put this at the top. However, in a way, I do also think that this is cheating, if I'm being honest. I mean, look, Saints Row 2 takes place in what, 2008, the late 2000s? This is not a game that takes place in the 1980s. You know, when I hear 80s music, do you know what game I think of? Vice City. I don't think of Saints Row 2. And so, I'm just being honest with you, though my ears very much appreciate these great tracks, it does kind of feel a bit out of place. Still, good tunes are good tunes, and hey, I'm not complaining. Tied on S tier, come on, it has to be K-Rhyme again. I mean, of course K-Rhyme has to be at the top. I mean, this is the radio station as far as I'm concerned. Yeah, amazing tracks this time around. Arguably better than last time? Dunno, but I like it. S tier. And on A tier, it's of course classic again. What can I say? I love my Mozart. B tier, and this might shock you, but easy. Yeah, seriously, though I didn't really like this station in the last game, now it's undergone a significant transformation. Really relaxing tracks, I mean it's just, yeah, I really like it. And tied on B tier is The World. Now this is an interesting one, as when you reach 50% game completion, easy actually turns in to the world. Yeah, one of the great things about this game is that the radio actually is reactive to what you do in the game, rather than just being a static looping recording. Now the world, as its name implies, plays a lot of tunes from around the world, and it's really interesting actually. It's a lot of tracks that you wouldn't necessarily hear on typical mainstream radio, like Irish flute music and things like that. No, honestly, I really like it, check it out. On C tier, 420. Yeah, way better reggae in this game than Saints Row 1, it has to be said. But listening to this will definitely put you in a jolly mood. And tied on that would be funk. Funk is the kind of station that your dad listens to, and you pretend not to like it, but secretly, you do. D tier, Gen X and Ultor FM. You know, it really surprised me on the Saints Row retrospective just how many people commented that they loved Gen X and thought I was way too harsh on it. But folks, I'm just being honest with you, right? It ain't my cup of tea. It's a bit too moany, a bit too whiny for me. You know, it's kind of like midlife crisis music. Look, I'm just being honest with you. If you like it, great. Not my cup of tea. And I'm going to commit another cardinal sin and put K12 here too. Yeah, I just find its electronic tracks to be quite uninspiring this time around. And metal fans, brace yourself, because I'm putting the crunch in E tier. Now look, I know some people like metal, and I like metal, but I'm just being totally real with you guys. In my opinion, the music that plays on the crunch, it ain't music, it's torture. But even that isn't as bad as what I'm putting in F tier, and that's the Underground. I got nothing to say on the Underground. Probably the worst radio station I've ever heard in a game in my life. Gives me a headache every time I accidentally turn it on. Sorry to the one person that actually likes it. So yeah, there's my tier list. Hate it all you want, that's my opinion. Oh, but I almost forgot. Do you guys want to know what the best radio station really is? Hex Radio. That's right, ladies and gentlemen. Did you know that I do talk radio? Well, you should know, because I never keep my mouth shut. Tune in every Tuesday night and Friday night to hear some amazing shows like Love Doctors, Judge Alex, and World Service. Hex Radio. Saints Row 2, much like its predecessor, also has a multiplayer mode, but to be honest with you, I don't really think there's much point even talking about it anymore, as unlike Saints Row 1, it doesn't seem to have that much of an active community anymore. Which makes sense in a way, as Saints Row 2 is a game that's well over a decade old now, and unlike Saints Row 1, is split up across 3 different platforms with no crossplay, 2 of which are extremely niche due to 1. Being ancient with no backwards compatibility, such as in the case of the PS3, or 2. Technically screwed, such as with the PC version. It's unfortunate, but hey, that's what happens when you fail to support your old games. However, there is at least some useful multiplayer functionality in the form of co-op. That's right, you can play through the single player experience, except this time, not being single. Never actually tried this mode out myself, as I never had any brothers and sisters growing up. It's a very lonely upbringing, but anyway, yeah. Now, there is one thing about Saints Row 2 that bugs me, and that's that it came out in the late 2000s, and as you might remember, this was the time when DLC started to get pretty silly. And if you don't know what I mean, check this out. Okay, so as you can see, I'm on the Saints Row 2 main menu, and down here you'll see a little category called downloadable content, yeah, DLC. Saints Row 2 came out around the time where DLC was starting to become rampant. Saints Row 1 had some, but it wasn't that bad. But if we take a look here, right, this is hilarious. I haven't seen this old 360 menu in a while. Right, so, Saints Row 2, the price doesn't say there, but it's $9.99. That's how much I paid for it. Now, the game has 2 expansions, Corporate Warfare, and that's $6.99. But then you also have Ultor Exposed, which is $9.99 as well. So you have an expansion that costs just as much as the game, and then you have another one which costs almost as much. It annoys me how they always lower the price of games, but they never lower the price of expansions. But besides the point, what really gets me is, look at the price of these clothing items. I mean, look, hang on a minute. Let me just look at this. Look at it. Hot dog suit outfit. $4.99. Who's gonna pay $4.99 for a hot dog suit outfit? Or what about $1.99 for a flashy hat? Or $2.99 for a flashy cane? Jesus Christ. Saints Row 2, from a gameplay perspective, is an improvement from its predecessor in almost every regard. Sadly, the same cannot be said for its graphics and general cosmetics as a whole. It is no surprise to me that this game has become the fan favourite, as it is by far the more accessible of the two Saints Row games available, before the series would take its narrative nosedive. However, I do think that the flaws of this sequel are often overlooked, especially by those who haven't had the means to play the first game. It's certainly a gem, though unlike its older brother, not so hidden. It pains me that this game, as well as what came before it, are so inaccessible to play for the vast majority of people these days. If Volition had any brains, they would re-release the two again for modern hardware, so that these classics could be forever enjoyed as deserved. If you're an absolute madman and you haven't actually played Saints Row 2 before, all I can say is, what are you waiting for? 3 words. Long live Stillwater.
Ultor, a brighter future and a better life.